Our story begins on the 7th of January 2022 when I received a DM from my friend Max, better known on Twitter as ThomasFan100. They said they had found a funny image of what looked to be a lost story called Doctor Who and Thomas the Tank Engine. They said they'd just been looking through some old internet archives and had found it, labelled as artwork from Doctor Who magazine. After I'd stopped laughing at the absurdity of it all, I didn't really know what to think, and so I just posted it. And for a while that was that. It was just a funny image we found. But then someone sent me a message saying that it wasn't actually official. I felt a bit down, but then when I looked where it came from, it led me down quite a weird rabbit hole. It came from a place called the New Zealand Doctor Who fan club. So as you may or may not know, I'm quite a fan of Doctor Who as well as Thomas, so I just had to look at this. So this video will be something a little different from the normal. Instead of talking about the funny trains, I'm coming apart! I'm going to tell you a story, so sit back and enjoy the history of how this very odd crossover came to be, and the mystery behind this forgotten part of Doctor Who history. So first of all, what is the New Zealand Doctor Who fan club? Well, it started in 1987, when a Doctor Who themed magazine was made. It was called the Time Space Visualizer, shortened to TSV. It was named after a prop used in The Chase, a Doctor Who story from the 60s. It was a machine that let you look back in history. A fitting name in retrospect. TSB was created by two men, Paul Scoons and Paul Sinkovich, who both wrote and edited it. As stated in the editorial at the front by Paul Scoons, both of them were in university at the time, and he wrote most of the first issue. It was 28 pages long to start with, and photocopied onto A5 paper with articles reviewing books and episodes related to Doctor Who. On top of that, it also had its own original stories, and, in the first issue, an obituary for the recently passed Patrick Troughton. There was even a short history of how the Daleks started life. Really, the magazine is what YouTubers do today, giving thoughts on episodes and sharing your own ideas. This is something that should be spoken about more. So at this point I was fixated on this fanzine. I'd spent 2 hours straight just scrolling the website where many of the issues are hosted, reading the articles and viewing the artwork. And then, that's when I found it. One lone email address that belonged to Paul Scoons. I had no thoughts about making this into a video up until this point. While I wanted to, I knew my channel wasn't focused on Doctor Who and I didn't think anyone would really be interested. However, I did something out of my comfort zone on a whim. I emailed him. I had no clue if he would respond. I mean, this fanzine was made over 30 years ago. But I just asked if he could tell me anything about it, as I wanted to make a video on it. And then he replied, and to my utter shock even offered to let me interview him for this video. So throughout this video you should be seeing clips from that interview when relevant.
So my name's Paul Scoons. I live in New Zealand. I was born in the UK. I moved here when I was 5 years old. I've been a fan of Doctor Who since I was a little kid, since John Pertwee's first story, Spirit in Space, and I watched that in 1975 when I was 7 years old. It screened in New Zealand 5 years after the UK, so we got it quite a bit later. So lifelong obsession with Doctor Who. These days, dream come true, I actually work on the series. I do infotext subtitling for their Blu-ray range, and I've also written a book about Doctor Who comic strips called The Comic Strip Companion, and a second book on the way, and I've also written quite a few articles for Doctor Who magazine.
In 1988, the New Zealand Doctor Who fan club was born. The club was set up by Andrew Polsine, Scott Walker and Kay Lilly in Churchchrist. It was at the opposite end of the country to the TSV, with either the club or the TSV knowing of each other's existence. The TSV had its ups and downs in the early years when Doctor Who was still airing on TV. Most of the news came from overseas fans due to New Zealand airings of the show being much later than the original British ones. This led to rumours being mistaken for facts, and sometimes reviews having to focus on only a few parts of a story, as the rest of the parts had not yet aired. About a year later, when Paul heard about the club, he decided to let them take on TSV, as they both shared a small audience at the time. Paul Scoons stepped down from the editor role with a poorly aged comment about looking forward to what 1989 had in store for Doctor Who. For those unaware, in 1989 Doctor Who was taken off air.
There are worlds out there where the sky's burning, where the sea's asleep and the rivers dream. People made of smoke and cities made of song. Some of there's danger, some of there's injustice, somewhere else the tea's getting cold. Come on, Ace, we've got work to do.
Of course, when the fanzine started up, the show was still airing in the UK, but not long afterwards we went into the wilderness years where the show was cancelled, but no one realised that at the time, and people were hopeful it was going to come back. Could you give some insight to what it was like in those uncertain years when you weren't sure if Doctor Who was going to return?
Well, I think you've completely nailed it there, that every year we thought this is the year it'll come back. You know, we obviously ended up being 50. If you don't count the Paul McGann movie, it was off for 15 odd years, and that's a phenomenal long time. You know, that's someone who wasn't born at the beginning of it being a fan by the end. That's a long time not for Doctor Who not to be around. And I think we would have been probably quite disheartened and maybe given up a little bit if we'd realised at the start that that's what we were in for.
In 1988, you offered TSV to the New Zealand Doctor Who club. How did you feel about that at the time? Did you ever expect to return to it?
Yeah, that was a bit odd, because what happened was, when I started TSV, it was just a fanzine. There was no fan club. And that was mid-1987. So we're only talking a year before the fan club. And when the fan club started in Christchurch, I'm in Auckland, and Christchurch is the other end of New Zealand. And they didn't know about me. They didn't know about the club. They didn't know about TSV, rather, and I didn't know about the club. So we started within a year of each other, completely independently. You know, two different groups having completely the same idea. Let's start a Doctor Who organisation and get everyone together. So that was quite coincidental, and maybe it was something to do with the 25th anniversary coming up. Maybe it's because we were getting a lot of repeats of Doctor Who on television at that time. It just seemed to be the perfect time to start a fan organisation in New Zealand. But like I say, New Zealand's a relatively small place compared to other countries. And it just felt like, well, when I heard about the club, and I'd done the first 6 issues of the fanzine by that point, I thought to myself, well, what's the point of doing a separate fanzine and a separate club? Let's just merge the two. And so it just seemed logical to me just to give the fanzine to the club. It meant less work for me. I was still involved. I still wrote for the fanzine. I still was very much, you know, a regular contributor. But I thought, well, let someone else do all the hard work of actually putting it together and printing it out, and I can just sit back and go, well, I started that, and now someone else is doing it. That was fine by me. I had no problem with doing that.
The next issue of TSV started with Andrew Polsine and Scott Walker announcing they'd taken over after they accepted Paul Scoon's offer. The format changed, but the content stayed mostly the same, apart from the new addition of a few comics drawn by Graham Mayer and Murray Jackson, and some art by Scott Walker himself. Another change in the TSV at this time is how it grew from a purely factual newsletter style of fanzine to a more social one, where people shared their experiences and how they started watching Doctor Who. Despite stepping down as the editor, Paul would continue to submit his own stories to the fanzine, which were published. In the next issue, released in August 1988, it was said that only Cliff Richard and Elvis Presley had bigger fan clubs in New Zealand at the time. TSV continued on without any major issues outside a few delays for the rest of 1989. Allow me to cut in here again for my own input to say that it amazes me just how little there is online for such a big club, a magazine so full of charm, wit, and deserves to be known by more people outside of New Zealand. I have been into Doctor Who for the last 12 years, and yet I'd never heard of TSV, or the club around it. The fanzine was also far ahead of its time. While BBC heads were talking about shutting down the show in August 1989, an article in TSV 14 by Craig Young spoke about if the Doctor should become a woman. After explaining all points of view on the matter, the article came to the conclusion that the Doctor could be played by any gender, as long as they actively opposed oppression, something many fans would agree in with this debate, which somehow is still going on to this day, even though Jodie Whittaker and Joe Martin have shown proof that a woman can play the role just fine. Things were running well, and TSV continued without change, the world largely unaware of just how long Doctor Who would be off air, and everything ran like normal until December 1990, when the club and TSV changed owners and head office. Paul Scoons, John Peddle, Chris Mander, and Felicity Fletcher took over as production moved to Auckland. TSV 21 was the first to be made under the new Auckland team, and brought with it a new redesign to the format as well as the logo, which would stick around for most of the TSV's life until its last redesign in 2006. Yes, when the club moved to Auckland, TSV came back into your hands. How did it feel to see how it had changed since you'd stopped running it?
Sure, yeah. Oh, it had been about 2.5 years that it was away, and when it came back, it was a fairly different beast. It had got bigger. The membership had vastly increased. Struggling to remember, I think there's about 150 people maybe by the time it came back. Got up from the original, let's say, 20 readers. So it had grown quite considerably. It had become a lot more social. When I did the fanzine originally, it was very much just news and articles about Doctor Who. That was it, just solid information. When it came back, there were lots of articles about how they'd all met up for a games night and things like that, and what video days they were having. It was very much sort of a social organisation newsletter, and it was fine. It had become a different beast in my absence, and the reason I took it back was simply because no one else was really prepared to take it on, and I felt this is my baby. I didn't want to see it die. I'd established it, and there was the risk that it was just going to go under. The reason that I took it back was partly due to John Pertwee. There'd been a Doctor Who convention organised by the club the previous year in New Zealand. The first big convention with an overseas, a guest from the series. It had John Pertwee and Mark Strickson. And the organisers of it were sort of just burnt out afterwards. They'd spent so much time and money putting this convention on that they just really didn't have anything left, and they were just sick of it all and just wanted to walk away from the whole thing. And so it looked to me like the whole thing was going to fall apart. And so I thought, well, no, I've got to rescue this. So I said, look, if you're not going to do it anymore, let me take it back and do it. So that's why I got it back.
In issue 23, we hear TSV received a Double Gammy Award for the Best New Zealand Produced Doctor Who fanzine. The Double Gammies were awards run by the Australian Doctor Who fandom at the time. Again, things continued going as normal with TSV, never really acknowledging the show's break from air. Doctor Who was used to taking yearly breaks from time to time, but by July, many fans were worried the show had been axed, and Paul Scoons wrote an article about it. He stated how, if the show had been axed, then sending in hate to the BBC was pointless. He spoke on rumours about an X-rated return, a cartoon return, and even a dreaded American return of Doctor Who, the latter becoming true with the 1996 movie. He lamented that the show ended on a high note, and that was the reason for the fandom still being alive. He was right, of course. Looking back today at the time fans now refer to as the wilderness years, it was season 26's quality and the string of novels that kept fans interested while the BBC were not. As the years went on with no sign of Doctor Who returning to TV, TSV and the fan club both grew in members as well as size. In TSV 34, released in July 1993, the words "It's Back" were boldly pushed across the front cover. This was in reference to the production starting on the anniversary special that was looking to kickstart Doctor Who back onto TV. It was announced to be cancelled 2 days after the issue was mailed out. It's fair to say TSV didn't have the best luck with anniversary special news. In the next issue, Paul argues that through constant news, videotapes, and books being put onto store shelves, that Doctor Who is more alive then than it had ever been when it had been on air. In a way, he was right, not only for the books, however. I would argue fanzines like TSV played a big role in keeping interest in the show alive.
But like I said, every year we thought this will be the year it'll come back. This will be the year we'll get some news. And there are always little snippets of news and rumours of things happening. And it's possible to look back through the TSVs and see on the news pages, oh, there's talk of this happening and that might happen. And you can see that, all through fandom, that people were just clinging on to any hope that the series might come back. So yeah, it was a very weird time. And as time went on, and I think probably it was only after the McGann movie and we realised this didn't become a series, that's the point where people go, oh, it's probably not coming back. So there's the early wilderness years where there's so much optimism and so much hope. And there's the later wilderness years after the McGann movie. So we're talking the late 90s through to the early 2000s, where it's kind of like, it's probably not coming back, but we've got the books, we've got the Big Finish audios, we've got the magazine, we've got the comic strip. This is what Doctor Who is now. And the books were quite prolific. I mean, I was a big fan of the novels. We had the New Adventures, and then we had the BBC novels, and there are hundreds of the things, and they were out every month. So it gave us something to talk about in the fanzine. So, you know, a lot of the TSV readers are readers of the books, so we could write articles and reviews and everything of those books, and that became new Doctor Who in a way. And then when Big Finish came along, that was another shot in the arm, because, of course, then we had the actual actors from the series being in Doctor Who stories. So it became much more real Doctor Who in a sense. I mean, it's possibly Big Finish has become a bit sidelined since the series has come back, but certainly at the time they were the big thing in the late 90s, early 2000s. So, yeah, Doctor Who wasn't there. But I mean, in some ways that made TSV that much more important, because it was a lifeline to people who are missing the series. It was a way of keeping in touch with other fans who were also missing the series. We were able to bond over our common sort of disappointment that it wasn't Doctor Who, but at the same time celebrating what we did have, the Doctor Who that was left, and looking back over the old series. When there's no new series, you spend that much more time looking at the old and reanalyzing it. And of course, during the 90s, that was the time when all the VHSs were coming out, and later the DVDs. So there was a whole rediscovery of people who hadn't seen these stories before. So each time a new VHS would come out, we'd do an issue on it. So there'd be like, you know, let's say Mark of the Rani came out in 1996. And so we'd do like a sort of a cover article and a review and everything, because that was the current VHS, and the local distributors of the VHSs would send them to us for free, because they recognized that we were promoting their product. So they were probably selling a lot more VHSs because we were doing the articles on them. So, and then obviously when the DVDs came along, we started doing big articles on the DVDs, because that was the only new Doctor Who, you know, that was well, even though it was the old series, but yeah, it seems weird now, but you know, we were kind of just picking over the scraps of what was actually available.
It is also important to note, TSV had a big, ever-changing team behind it. From cover illustrators, and many writers and readers who sent in their own stuff. However, as I say, that list was ever-changing, which is why I'm inclined to stick with the stuff about Paul, as he was there from the beginning. Paul was kind enough to tell me a bit about these people who worked on TSV over the years. So of course you were one of the people who started TSV, but there was many people who worked alongside you on it over the years. Could you maybe speak about some of the people that helped make it possible?
Oh, absolutely. Like I say, it was far from being a solo effort. I mean, I can't, I'm the one talking to you, but I can't take much of the credit myself. Some of the key people, there's John Predel, who's a very long time good friend of mine, and John will be familiar to some people as the editor of the broadcast Doctor Who website, which chronicles the Doctor Who screenings all around the world. And he's written a 2-volume book called Time Link, which chronicles the sort of the chronology of the television series, which is a phenomenal work in itself. Now, John's a very big fan of the show, and his work appears throughout TSV, and basically anytime I needed a deeply technical article on the series, I knew I could just go to John and just give him a subject, and he'd go away and come up with something for me. So he is a very big asset when the fanzine was going. Scott Gray, who a lot of Doctor Who magazine readers will know his name well as the longtime writer and editor and artist on the comic strip. He back when he lived in New Zealand years ago, he was a regular contributor to TSV. He designed a lot of the covers. David Bishop, again, a big name author now, but back in the day, he was a regular contributor to TSV, again, another New Zealander. Adam Christopher. Now, Adam actually was my assistant editor for a while on TSV. Adam Christopher is his author name. He's a he's written a number of books now. He's now actually writing official Star Wars licensed novels, so he's done really well for himself. But like I say, back in the day, he was assistant editor with me on TSV as Adam McGeechan, which is his real name. And I published his first fiction, and he eventually took over from me as editor on the last few issues of the magazine. So there's been quite a few people. Alistair Hughes, who's a very regular contributor, Peter Adamson. I'm probably forgetting a lot of names because there are a lot of people involved. I should say too, people like David J. Howe, Stephen James Walker were very supportive. They wrote stuff for me. Gary Russell, Andrew Pixley. Now, Andrew is a big name in Doctor Who fandom, is a long-time researcher of the show. A huge amount of respect for Andrew. He just phoned me up from the UK one day, one evening, and said, I borrowed some issues off a friend, and I think they're actually phenomenal, and I'd love to write some stuff for you. So Andrew actually started writing stuff for TSV, which is fantastic, given that he's such a high-profile researcher. So that was really brilliant too. And Robert Sherman, who obviously went on to write, for the series himself, he was also a regular columnist for a while. So we had some really big name contributors in there, and some real talent. So I was the coordinator. I was pulling it all together and putting it all together, but I was reliant on a lot of talent.
Yes, it fairly seems like there was a lot of people involved in making it as big as it was. That being said, however, a lot of you came here to hear about Thomas the Tank Engine, and now I can finally fill you in on that part of the mystery. Every issue of TSV since it began had some form of artwork, and in the end of TSV 42, as the back cover, was a piece drawn by Richard Sloanes, entitled Doctor Who and Thomas the Tank Engine. This was the piece that started it all. However, once I found out about TSV, I must admit, I found its story and history just as, if not more interesting than the appearance of Thomas in it. It's likely Richard based this image of Thomas off the Railway series version of him, not only to match up with the style of Doctor Who books at the time, but also since the TV series was still relatively new. If I had to guess, I would say it was based off this famous cover of the second book, Thomas the Tank Engine, partly due to its fame, but also due to the fact Thomas has his dipped running board, which he would lose in branchline engines after he crashed through the station master's house. Now back to TSV. Nicholas Withers, who wrote the editorial this time, continues the tradition of jinxing a new series by stating he's looking forward to a new series to come from the TV movie. Of course, that never happened, due to the TV movie not being enough to convince Fox, nor the BBC at the time, of Doctor Who's worth. The next few issues of TSV cover the TV movie with Paul McGann in great detail, and while wonderful reviews for the time, they serve as greater archives for how the TV movie was seen by fans, both outside the UK and in general at the time. In a way, it's very sad to see how with every passing issue, hopes for a new series to be kickstarted by the movie slowly start to die, as both Fox and the BBC played hardball with the concept. Of course, looking back, I and many other fans would not want to change the series we got eventually for the world, but there'll always be that sad curiosity of what might have been. Issue 50 of TSV was a fun read for many reasons. Not only was the 10th anniversary of TSV, but Tom Baker had been in New Zealand to film an advert. Paul was contacted by the people filming the advert for reference material about Doctor Who. I shall let him tell you the rest of the story himself, as he puts it so well. In its time, TSV hosted lots of interviews with people who worked with and alongside the show, and as you said earlier, you've met some people yourself through the TSV, such as John Pertwee, and of course, when Tom Baker went over to New Zealand, you spent an afternoon with him when he was recording a commercial. Could you tell me a bit what that was like to meet these people you'd seen on the screen?
A little bit intimidating, a little bit exciting. Like meeting any stars of a show that you've enjoyed for such a long time. It was remarkable because I guess in the UK, you can sort of get on a bus or a train and you can go and meet these actors at conventions regularly. These events seem to be on all the time over there, or at least, probably have been in the past. But in New Zealand, it's such a long, it's not, there's probably nowhere on earth you could go that's further from the UK than New Zealand. It's as far away as you can possibly go. So it's hard to get actors out here. So it's really quite an event when someone does turn up. So like I say, John Pertwee was the first one I met. John Pertwee and Mark Strickson, actually, both in the same year. And that was a little bit sort of, it does your head in a little bit the first time I think you meet a Doctor Who actor and you go, this is someone I've watched on the television screen and now I am talking to them. John Pertwee, I didn't get to spend a lot of time with. I was just at a convention that a lot of other people were at, but he was thoroughly entertaining. He was very, very master showman. Tom Baker, I met years later in the mid 90s. A advertising company in New Zealand hired Tom Baker to reprise the role as Doctor Who for a series of life insurance commercials, I think it was.
The answer the whole universe has been seeking for centuries is at the end of a telephone line.
And they got him out to New Zealand. They built a TARDIS set, both the police box and the console, and they got his costume and they basically dressed him up as Doctor and got him to appear as the Doctor to sell life insurance, which is, to me, seems rather bizarre.
The next best thing is a telephone number which will help you to start a savings plan for the 21st century.
The reason I got involved was when they were putting these together, they got in touch with me as the person who ran the Doctor Who fan club and said, have you got, any plans? Can you help us out? Because we need to build these props. And so I had obviously things like the Doctor Who technical manual and some other bits and pieces. So I sent them copies of these things. And as a thank you to me for all my help as a consultant, if you like, they said, well, come along and watch this being filmed. And also, too, we'll let you have Tom Baker for an afternoon. So you can run a Doctor Who fan club event. And I was just like, what? I can have Tom Baker at a Doctor Who fan club event? This is just like, up until that time, all we'd done is we just had video days, group of fans get together, watch a video. Suddenly they're going to have Tom Baker standing in front of them. That was like a huge thing. So that all went fine. Meeting Tom Baker was he's a very odd person because when he's on, because obviously I watched him making these commercials, he's very professional on camera. He's very much like, as you'd expect Tom Baker to be, very sort of, larger than life and really quite entertaining and putting a lot of his own personality into it. When he's off screen, he seems to, at least for me, I can't say for anyone else, he almost like sags a bit, if you know what I mean. He becomes a lot more weary, a lot more grumpy and harder to talk to. And a lot of other people I've talked to, a lot of fans who've met Tom Baker over the years have said that he used to be like this. Apparently he's a lot easier to get along with now, but back then he was very difficult for people. So, I mean, I met him, having watched the whole day's filming. I was introduced to him at the very end of the day, and he was quite shocked to find out that I wasn't a member of the film crew and was actually just a fan. And he was a bit alarmed at that, and I had to reassure him. And he was very sort of cantankerous, if you like, because he was quite tired. And he was worried about doing this fan day because he said, well, he's got a different method. If he's talking to children, he's one person, he'll play the Doctor. And if he's talking to adults, he'll be himself. And he was worried that it might be a mix of both adults and children. So that really worried him that he couldn't be both at the same time. But I was worried that he might not turn up, that he might get cold feet because he wasn't under contract or anything. This was just a favor to me. We weren't paying to have him there. He was just turning up on his own goodwill. So if Tom had woken up on the day and said, I don't want to do this fan thing, I'll go and do something else, we'd have had no recourse. So we're very, very relieved that it all went smoothly. And Tom, as I say, when he's on stage, he performs. He's in the moment and he loves to entertain his fans. And I think watching him talk, he gets a real buzz out of the adulation he gets from the audience. It really gives him energy. It's probably true of a lot of Doctor Who actors, I think. So that was a phenomenal once in a lifetime experience. And in recent decades, more so since the Doctor Who fan club ended, there's been a organisation called Armageddon that's run every year in New Zealand, and that's a that's a sort of a pop culture expo, and that's not just Doctor Who by any means. That's all sort of movies and television, sort of pop culture. So it's actors from movies and television that come out here for a weekend long expo, and that's held in various cities around New Zealand. Now, the guy who runs that, guy called Bill Gerards, he used to be the social coordinator for the Doctor Who fan club. So he worked with me on running events in Auckland, and that's what Armageddon grew out of that, because he just got sick of just doing Doctor Who stuff, and so he wanted to do like general sci-fi. So he's brought out people like Sylvester McCoy, Paul McGann. I had Colin Baker, and I was able to interview Colin Baker at one of these events. We sort of sat him down in a hotel room for a couple of hours and just chatted to him about his career, which is fascinating. Colin Baker is a very, very nice guy, very, very generous and giving of his time. And it was just probably one of the best Doctor Who interviews I've ever done. So that was a really phenomenal experience. So yeah, I've met a few. I've been over to the UK a few times, and I've met a few actors over there. But it's really quite standout when a Doctor Who actor comes over to New Zealand, and it's really quite something. I've met Peter Capaldi. He did a stage. He toured a show where he just basically does a talk for a couple of hours about his career, and I met him after that. But I don't think I've ever met any of the other actors from the new series, though.
However you plan to spend your future, plan on having something to spend.
Another interesting article in TSV, also by Paul, was the overview of the Wilderness Years. With hindsight, we know that they started in 1989 and would not end until Russell T Davies returned the show to air in 2005, but at the time the TV movie looked like it could put an end to them and finally allow Doctor Who to return. Paul gave a brief overview of the events that went on in the Wilderness Year, and it's an amazing read for any fan, like myself, who wasn't around at the time. In issues 53 and 54 of TSV, we hear Paul tell the story of how he and a friend of his found part 1 of The Crusade, a First Doctor story that was thought to be lost to time. It was discovered in New Zealand, something that alongside TSV itself doesn't get much attention, and it truly deserves it. So outside TSV, you also became part of Doctor Who history in a way, when in 1999 you helped discover a missing episode of Doctor Who, The Lion. Could you tell me a bit about how that came about and how you helped find it?
Well, that's really every fan's dream come true, isn't it, to find a missing episode? That's sort of the number one thing I think everyone would love to do. Maybe short of playing the Doctor or writing for the series, then finding a missing episode is the dream. But it was it wasn't like we were looking for missing episodes. It just so happened that a friend of mine, Neil Lambis, heard a rumor that there might be a missing episode in a collector's collection of films in New Zealand. And he followed up that lead, and he asked me to come along with him to go and visit this guy, a guy called Bruce Grenville in Auckland, who ran a sort of he had a sort of film club, and he had a collection of just films of all sorts of things, documentaries, old films. And he just bought this film of Doctor Who from a fellow collector and had it in his collection. And he wasn't a Doctor Who fan. He didn't realize that it was missing. He took some convincing it was missing. He just thought we were wrong and that the BBC would have everything. He didn't realize they were missing stories. So we went along to see him, not really. There's been a lot of hoaxes over the years, a lot of false leads. I was fairly confident that this guy wasn't making it up, that he did have a Doctor Who episode, but my thought was it's probably one that exists, because if it had been a missing one, surely someone would have identified it by that point. So I thought, no, it's just one that everyone has, and we doesn't need to be found. And it turned out to be The Lion, and Neil and I were absolutely flabbergasted when we watched it at Bruce's place, and we were just like, my goodness, this is just the find, this is huge. And there was kind of I took charge of the process of contacting the BBC and arranging the sending over of the film. So that was my involvement in it. So I helped with restoring a little bit of the history of the series, if you like.
The 58th issue from September 1999 is particularly of interest to people who like Big Finish. as Paul mentions having listened to the Silence of Time, and while he praises it, he makes comments about the high prices, especially to export it to New Zealand. In issue 59 of TSV from January 2000, Paul once again speaks about how great the expanded media has been from Doctor Who while it was off the air, but this time things have changed. He ends his editorial on a somewhat somber note. I want to be thrilled and surprised by Doctor Who again. Can we have our series back, please? It's such a sad thing to read. It would be yet another 5 years until Doctor Who returned to air, but at the time it must have looked hopeless and like Big Finish had taken over, and quality as Big Finish is, it just can't compare to a TV show. The more I read of TSV, the more I just want to tell you everything, but every issue is so jam-packed with great articles, it would be impossible. This is the reason for time skips to the most prominent changes. If you want to read the whole of TSV, a link in the description will take you to their website, where I got most of the information for this video. While my channel isn't a Doctor Who focus, it would be amazing if you could share this video in Doctor Who circles, so this amazing magazine could be viewed by everyone. And let me know down in the comments if you want to see more Doctor Who content from me in future. TSV came to its end in 2009, along with the New Zealand fan club. Paul was kind enough to share with me why it ended. I think it's quite an astonishing thing, and it's all the more surprising to me that it seems to have been almost lost to time, apart from its own website, because there's very little talk about it online, and I think that's quite a shame. I'm not sure if you have any thoughts to why you think it maybe got lost and isn't spoken about as much as some of the other media in the wilderness years.
Sure. I mean, I think the big issue is the internet, is that back in the day, if someone wanted to write or draw something and they want to show other fans, then getting in a fanzine was the best way to do that. So TSV had lots of material because people wanted to, show off what they were doing. When the internet came along, it became that much more of a struggle to get people to contribute stuff, because they could just write their own stories and post them online, or draw their own drawings, or whatever it is they were doing, or their articles or their research or their news or anything. They could just post it instantly. They didn't have to wait like 3 or 4 months for a fanzine to come out. They could just do it that day and start getting feedback on it. So I understand that, and I'm not sort of complaining about that, but it does mean that fanzines had a much more difficult task of finding material and finding people willing to contribute. And I think that's not just TSV, that's a worldwide issue. And a lot of fanzines dropped off with the internet came along. And a lot of people moved to doing online forums and online, publications and what have you. And eventually so TSVs became almost like once a year, because it was that much harder to get an issue together. And then eventually it was like, well, we're struggling to find material and we're all very busy. As I mentioned, I'd stopped editing the magazine by the end, and new editor, Adam, he went overseas and became a big name author, so he didn't have the time to do it anymore. And there was really no one else around to keep it going. So, and I think perversely, the other issue is that when the series came back and Doctor Who, as you know, just became this sort of worldwide phenomenon all over again. There were, even in New Zealand, there were billboards, the whole buses were decorated with Chris Eggleston and Billy Piper. It was just like, this is a niche thing that we'd loved for years was suddenly big mainstream. And I think people didn't need a fan club anymore because everyone was a Doctor Who fan. And people, you could bump into someone on the street, chances are they were watching the series. It was that big. And you'd overhear, groups of people just chatting about Doctor Who. And it's kind of like, once upon a time, you'd never come across Doctor Who fans just casually like that. They were so few and far between. So it had kind of been taken out of our hands and become very much a mainstream thing, particularly, in the Eccleston and Tennant years. That was probably the pinnacle of it. Arguably it's dropped away a little bit in recent years, but it was absolutely huge back then. I mean, even my mother was watching and talking about it and loving it. And so it didn't need a fan club anymore. It's almost like the fan club existed for the wilderness years. It was like it kept the series alive when there wasn't a series. It kept the interest going when there were very few fans, and we were all like sort of diehards who wouldn't give up. But I think once the series came back, TSV started to die, and it did limp on for a few years. The last issue we did was 2008. maybe. Yeah, I think it was about the time Matt Smith was first cast, maybe 2009. I think that was the very last issue, was the announcement of Matt Smith's casting. So it has been gone for a long time now. It's over 10 years since the last issue was published.
So with TSV over, that's the end of its 22-year history. Strange again to think that it ended only 10 years ago. For fear of repeating myself, I must ask again how I and many fans I know have never heard of it. While TSV was a New Zealand fanzine, it wasn't limited to it. The fan club helped host conventions in New Zealand such as 1990's WhoCon, which was attended by both John Pertwee and Mark Strickson. On top of this, Paul, as part of the fanzine, even published retellings of lost stories at the time, such as Sharda, The Pirate Planet, City of Death, and more. This to me feels like something we should be celebrating. Paul was very nice and was really helpful with helping me research TSV and the New Zealand fan club, and without him this video would not be very good. Anyone who wishes to keep up with what Paul is doing, his Twitter shall be linked below. I asked him if he could tell me a bit more about himself. What were you doing back before it started?
Well, I was a long-term fan, but I didn't know any other fans. So for about the first 10 years, I was, as a kid, from about the ages of 7 through to 17, I was very, lonely as a fan. My friends weren't really into Doctor Who, and so I didn't really have anyone to talk about it. And I didn't know any other fans at all. And this is in the 1980s. There was no internet. You couldn't log on to any forums or anything. There was no way of finding other fans. And in New Zealand, there were no fan clubs or anything. So it was very much, I had the magazine and I had the Target books, and I had nothing to, no one to discuss it with. So what happened was, when I went to university in 1987, I met up with another fan, also called Paul, who was and together we realized, he had some pen pals, and we thought, well, we could actually just create a club. And we thought, well, rather than a club, because we're all scattered around the country, let's just create a fanzine and send that out by mail, because again, still no internet. So everything's very much sort of just, it sounds really primitive now, probably from your perspective, but back then that was the best way you could actually keep in touch with people, was by mail. So yeah, that was the inspiration behind it, was to, just get people in New Zealand particularly all connected who are interested in Doctor Who.
But yes, as you say, you're obviously a big fan of Doctor Who, and you started with John Pertwee. Who would you say would be the Doctor in your favourite era of the show?
If I can choose one from classic and one from modern, I think from classic, I think it would be Peter Davison, partly because I think he's such a fantastic and sometimes underrated actor. And also because when I became really, really obsessed with Doctor Who, he was the current Doctor. So from me, from a nostalgia perspective, he's the Doctor for me. And also too, because a lot of the stories I've worked on or chosen to work on for the Blu-ray range have been Peter Davison stories too. I feel that's very much my era. That's the one where I have the most affinity. From the modern series, I'd go for another Peter. I'd go for Peter Capaldi. I think he's a fabulous actor. And even before he was cast as the Doctor, when you'd have those sort of fan conversations, who would you cast? He was always top of my list. So yeah, I was actually thrilled when he got to be the Doctor. I thought he was superb.
Yes, I'd agree.
Excellent. Good choice.
So when you started up the TSV, did you ever expect it to grow as big as it eventually did?
No. Like I say, it was always just going to be a fanzine for a small group of New Zealand fans. It was never going to be any bigger than that. I mean, I'm trying to remember. It's obviously 35 odd years ago now, which makes me seem incredibly old. But we just basically, there were only probably about 20 members. Wasn't very big at all. It was just a very small, if you could have got us all together in the same room. I mean, we were scattered all throughout New Zealand, and a lot of us never actually met up, but honestly, it was such a small group. But there wasn't another fan club, so we seemed, from nothing to 20 was an achievement in itself. But no, I never had any big aspirations for it. It just basically, I think other countries had clubs. I mean, one of my reasons for starting it was Australia had a club, Australia being the closest country to New Zealand for those in the UK. But they called themselves the Australasian Fan Club, and Australasian means New Zealand and Australia. but they didn't really have any New Zealand coverage or any content or anything. And so that kind of frustrated me. And I was going, well, we really ought to have our own identity and our own fan club. And so that was my main driving impetus behind it, was to give something for our own people. I didn't have any great aspirations for it. I didn't even know how long it was going to last. It was just, let's do something, because now I've met some other fans. Let's all keep in contact with each other.
So over the years, you had to put together a lot of issues of TSV. What was the process like of choosing the articles and putting them together?
Sure. I was very reliant on people. I mean, obviously it's a fanzine, so no one's getting paid for this. It was very much like a volunteer effort. So I was very reliant on finding and retaining talented people, and I'm talking about both writers and artists who are prepared to actually every few months put pen to paper and actually produce something for me. When I first started, it was very much on a typewriter. I'd photocopy, pictures and type up the pages on a typewriter. And that seems very crude by modern standards. No one would ever dream of doing that now as a fanzine. And probably over time, I was kicking and screaming, introduced to computers and web processors, and it became doing it professionally, desktop layout. I'd say that thanks to TSV, I taught myself a lot about how to publish, and use desktop publishing, and use all the sort of the Microsoft programs to make this a much more of a sort of a professionally looking product. And it just gradually evolved over the years to the point where by the time the last few issues, it was totally like being done desktop publishing and digital, and then it's outputted as a PDF to the printer. So we'd got very slick at it by the end, but it was a gradual evolution over those years. In total, we did 76 regular numbered issues, plus quite a few specials. So I think if you add those to it, it works out at about 100 issues altogether, which is quite a phenomenal achievement.
You said a bit earlier about how you've been working with the show in recent years. I wondered if you could say a bit more about what exactly your job entails and what you do in relation to Doctor Who.
Well, this kind of comes out of TSV. Actually, I have to credit TSV with for getting me this job, because one of my readers was a very nice gentleman called Martin Wiggins in the UK, and Martin became the editor of the what were then the DVD production notes, which is the feature on the DVDs and now the Blu-rays, which you can switch on, and it's a subtitle track that tells you how the story was made and what to look out for in the scenes and who the actors were and where they're filming, and where an actor changes their line or there's a blooper or something. So it's a very deeply technical, very informative, and honestly, it will tell you anything that you as much as you could possibly want to know about all the minutiae of the series, all the deeply, intensely fan trivia, if you like. And I'd written a number of articles that were quite detailed about the series for TSV over the years, and Martin was aware of that, and he thought my articles obviously were quite good. And so when he became editor and he was putting together a team of people to work on these subtitles, he contacted me one day by email and said, would I be interested in trying out for this work? And at the first I thought, well, I'm not quite sure. I've never done anything of that technical before. And also being in New Zealand, how on earth was I going to do this? It happened that when Martin asked me, I was just about to visit the UK, quite coincidentally. So when I was over there, I chatted to him a lot. We never actually met up. We didn't find time to meet up, but I did talk to him a lot on the phone. And I did visit the Caversham archives, which have all the reading material, all the original production documentation, the stuff that's now scanned on the Blu-ray sets that you can download on the PDFs. So all those files were kept at Caversham, so I was able to go along there for a day and sit down and actually just go through the files. And the first story I worked on, which was like, if you like, my audition piece, was Plant of Fire. And then I did a lot more Davison stories for season 21. So I did everything from The Awakening through to Case of Androzani and Vengeance on Varos, Dragonfire, Scream of the Shalka. So I think that was my sort of set of DVD subtitles, and I did those from 2008 through to about 2013. So that's the period I was working on it. And then for a few years, it's kind of like, well, that's done. Classic series is all done on DVD, nothing more to do. And then when the Blu-ray range started up with the box sets, Martin got back in contact and says, hey, we're doing more. We're going to go back and do some that were, before Martin got involved, the production subtitles weren't done the same way. And so the early stories they wanted to redo from scratch. So I was given Earthshock to do for the season 19 set. And also, and I've done a number of other ones yet. And I've got to be quite careful what I talk about because some of them haven't been released yet, so I can't say which ones I've done. But I worked on Trial of a Time Lord. Martin and I co-wrote that one. I did Battlefield, so that's one of mine. Just glancing over at the shelf to try and remind myself. But yes, like I say, there's a few I've done that, because of COVID and schedules changing, I've written ones over 2 years ago that still haven't been announced yet. So there are ones coming up. Stay tuned, shall we say? But yeah, I've done quite a few, and they're fun. They're a lot of work though. What happens is that I get sent a file which I can download, which is a copy of the master tape, and it's got a time code counter along the bottom of the screen. And so I have to write a script, and I've got to use the time code counter to say where the subtitle pops up on the screen and when it disappears again. It's usually up for about 5 to 8 seconds each one. And obviously, like a tweet, maybe I'm limited by the number of characters I can fit into a single subtitle. So sometimes there'll be a lot of interesting things happen on screen, and you've got to make a choice about what you can talk about because the moment's passed and you've gone, well, I only had the amount of time to talk about it. And there can be other times where nothing really happens for a long period of time. Two characters might be standing around talking about nothing really particularly interesting. And you've got the struggle of finding enough information to fill that space because you can't just leave nothing on screen. You've got to keep doing the subtitles all the way through the story. So it is a lot of challenge. It's fascinating too, getting to see a lot of the early scripts. One of the stories, which I'd love to say what it is, but I can't yet. I think we found a very early script for it, and I don't think many people have ever seen this script, but it casts some real information on the background of the story that no one really realized before. It's quite fascinating that these are stories that we've watched, you and I and everyone else has watched over and over again. And when you watch it that closely for subtitling, you find things that no one's noticed before. And you find details that no one's ever spotted. A classic example from Earthshock. Earthshock's a story that I've watched many times. Love the story, but I'd never noticed that there's a scene in episode 2 where the Doctor has to defuse the cyber bomb, and he gets his toolkit from the TARDIS, and he puts the tools on the bomb to defuse it. However, there's a short scene earlier in the episode where the bomb's ticking down, and his tools are already on top of the bomb before he even gets them. And I never noticed that. It wasn't until I was doing the subtitling that I thought, oh my God, that's a mistake. They've shot that out of order and no one's noticed. So that's fun to point that out in the subtitles. And then once the Blu-ray comes out, people come back to you and go, oh, I've never noticed that before. Oh, wow, that's wonderful. So that's the real joy of it, is discovering these details that you're the first person to ever document it. So that's always the aim when I take on a new story. I'm thinking, what can I find that no one's ever known about before? And there's usually at least one fact for each story that I managed to come up with. Another classic example that I love is Battlefield. And there's the character Elizabeth, who runs the pub in the first episode, and she's blind, and she's reading a Braille book the first time you see her. And you see the Braille book very closely on screen for a couple of seconds. So what I did was I screenshotted that. So you've got just all the raised bumps on the page, but on the Blu-ray, obviously it's clear enough to see the bumps. And I sent it off to the Royal Foundation of the Blind in New Zealand. And I said, look, is there anyone there who can sight read this? Because I'd looked up online Braille and I couldn't work out what it was. And I said, is there anyone there who can sight read these this and just tell me from the screenshot what it's saying? What is the book? Basically, I'm trying to work out what they're actually reading. So I thought, well, the BBC would have just got any book off the shelf, any Braille book, and just the list will do for the scene. No one's ever going to query it. And they managed to identify enough words for me to find out that it was actually Le Morte d'Arthur. It was actually the book about King Arthur. So they'd gone to the trouble, even though it's Braille, of finding the right book for her to read. So that, no one had ever realized that before. And so that was a great thing to put into subtitles, because that was like a first time discovery.
It's
so that's
interesting.
Yeah, that's a job I'm still ongoing, because the Blu-ray sets, as you know, are still coming out. So, but I'm aware it's a finite job. There will come a time when we've done them all. It is only the classic series. It is only the 20th century series. So I don't have any involvement whatsoever on the new series, which I like, because it means I'm spoiler free. So, when a new Jodie Whittaker story comes on screen, I know no more about it than you do, because all my work is to do with classic stuff. So that suits me just fine. I can love and watch the new series without being spoiled, and I can be absolutely intensely involved in knowing everything there is to know about the classic series. So I can compartmentalize those in my mind and keep those very separate from each other.
Mm-hmm.
And the other work I've done, you mentioned, what works led from TSV to now, is I've written a book called The Comic Strip Companion, which is a history of the Doctor Who comic strip. And the first book came out some years ago now, and that covers all the TV comic, Countdown, TV Action, TV 21 strips from the 1960s and 1970s. And that did really well. Lot of people have said how much they enjoyed it. And I'm close to finishing a second book, which covers the 1980s period of the comic strip, which will be a sequel to that. And so it's been quite a few years in the making, but I'm close to finishing that now. And again, that comes out of working on TSV, because, as I've mentioned before, David J. Howe and Stephen James Walker, who run Telos Books, they were also TSV readers, so they knew my work. So when I wrote to them and suggested doing a book on the comic strips, they instantly said, well, we know you, we know your work, we'd be quite happy for you to put a proposal together. So that was very smooth, because I didn't have to prove myself to them. They already knew the quality of my work. So I credit TSV with both of the jobs that I do now that are Doctor Who related. So although, like you say, TSV's long since gone, for me, it's been a sort of a launching board for a professional career. So I have to thank TSV for where I am now.
Yes, and hopefully with this video, we can spread the word to more people, because I think it's quite a shame that there's not many people who seem to speak about it online anymore. When looking back, it seems to have done a lot.
Yeah, it is 15 years old now, so it's understandable. Fandom has moved on. And a lot of fandom is probably now very much focused on the new series and the current stuff. And we're talking about a fan club that, like I say, wound up at the end of the David Tennant era. So it is quite a sort of an artifact of the old times, if you like. But a lot of the issues are available online. Maybe you can put the link in your YouTube video. But
of course,
but those issues are there for people to read, and I think that's how you discovered it, is just going online and finding the articles that way. And it's not everything. I think we haven't done the last 10, 15 issues, maybe still need to go up, and it's just lack of time. I haven't had I've still got all the original issues. I've still got all the original print masters as well. They're all like filed away safely in boxes. So it's a matter of getting the scanner out and scanning all the stuff that isn't already digitized. And so it's a bit of work to put it all together. And then I like to go back to the original contributors too, the original writers and artists, and get their permission to use their work. So that's a bit of time and effort. Because, you might have written something when you were a kid, and now you might be a professional adult and you might not want your name on it anymore. You might feel you don't want people going online and finding your work you did when you were a kid. So that's understandable. Mm-hmm. So there are things that we haven't put up from old issues of TSV because they've gone, well, I'm not happy with that anymore. It's not representative of where I am now. So you have to respect that. You can't just put the whole issue up and expect everyone to be happy with that. You've got to pick and choose what people are comfortable with. Mm-hmm. And two, it gives people the opportunity to rewrite and correct anything in their work. So I might say to someone, here's an article you wrote 20 years ago. Are you happy for this to go online? And they go, well, yes, but I think I can do a better job of it. So I let them rewrite it. So the versions you see online of some of the articles are rewrites. And I think that's noted down the bottom of the article if it is a rewrite. So it's an opportunity for people to update their work too if they want to do that. But it's been quite a few years since we've done a new, another issue on there. So, but there's still quite a lot of material on there. There's also all the classic Doctor Who novelizations have been done now, but for many years there were 5 missing. Pirate Planet, City of Death, Shada, Resurrection and Revelation of the Daleks. So we actually did our own fan novelizations of them. For many years they were very, very popular, and they're all available still to read online. The embarrassing thing is that every so often someone will contact me and says, I much prefer your version of Resurrection of the Daleks to the original, to the one that Eric Saywood's written. And I think that's embarrassing because he's the author of the story. He should be the better one. But there we go. And there's also the thing I'm quite proud of is that I researched the entire history of Doctor Who screenings in New Zealand. So the actual date and time that every single episode screened here in New Zealand, and that's all available on there as well. So, if you've got if someone who grew up in New Zealand has a childhood memory of watching, say, the one with the maggots, they can go online and see the exact date and time they were watching it and go, wow, that's how old I was, and that's the day I watched it. So that's really cool.
Yes, it's a great resource. I mean, I myself, in many different communities, I like to help with preserving lost media when I can. So it's really been quite inspirational looking back through TSV online and seeing it's all been saved and not lost to time.
Definitely, yeah. Well, as much as we can, it's there for people to enjoy and use. Like you say, it hasn't been lost. It's still there, and hopefully we can add more to it.
Again, thank you to Paul. He was a pleasure to talk to and was very patient with me as I did my first interview. And that's it. If you enjoyed this video, do let me know down below. Have you heard of TSV before, and do you plan to go give it a read through now?